Well, today on the show, I'm joined by Professor Erik Wielenberg. Erik joins me today to talk about godless normative realism. This all comes about from his book, Value and Virtue in a Godless Universe. I've read the book and watched a debate that Professor Wielenberg had with William Lane Craig a few years ago now. And there's actually a book that kind of follows on from that debate, which I've gone through too. But my ambition in this episode is to introduce you to the idea of godless normative realism. What does it look like for moral realism to hold, but for no deity to be involved whatsoever? In this conversation, Erik and I push into this idea, but also introduce time and time again common and normal objections that theists tend to raise to the idea of ethics holding without a God substantiating them. It was a fantastic conversation. I'm really excited to share it with you today. If it's your first time checking out the show, I'd ask you to hit the subscribe button and then select the bell notification icon. That's going to remind you whenever we release a video here on the channel. And if you wouldn't mind giving it a thumbs up and then sharing it with your friends, your family, your followers, we grow because you take the time to share these conversations. So please do share this one far and wide. Okay, enough of that. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Professor Erik Wielenberg talking about godless normative realism. Cheers. Hello and welcome to the show. My name's Samuel and today I'm joined by Professor Erik Wielenberg. Erik, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Sam. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these ideas with you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be chatting through godless normative realism, although we'll get into kind of what that means and how that looks. There's quite a lot of stuff around the edges that I thought would be a lot of fun to touch on. And I thought it'd be quite interesting actually to start talking about C.S. Lewis. You actually use a ton of C.S. Lewis quotes in your book, Value and Virtue in a Godless Universe. And I think you've actually written a book called God and the Reach of Reason, which also looks at C.S. Lewis and some of his writings. And if I'm not mistaken, I think you either have taught or do teach a C.S. Lewis course itself. So would you mind kind of chatting me through kind of C.S. Lewis and kind of what this theist means for you?
Sure. Yeah, you're right. So I've got the book, as you mentioned, and I teach at DePauw University in Greencastle, Indiana, which is one of these U.S.-style small liberal arts colleges. And that the class that you mentioned that focuses on C.S. Lewis, it kind of follows the book. And the idea is to put C.S. Lewis in conversation with Bertrand Russell and David Hume, who, of course, both come at things from a non-Christian perspective. And so that class it's called a first-year seminar. So it's all first-year students that take it. But yeah, I'm kind of a fan of C.S. Lewis. Obviously, he and I disagree about a few things, but what I appreciate about Lewis is his clarity. I think he has sort of an amazing style, and he really has this knack for taking complicated, obscure ideas and presenting them in an accessible way. I also think he's intellectually honest, so I kind of appreciate all of that. And as a person, he has a sort of a very, I think, compelling background. He fought in World War I and was pretty seriously injured. And he actually went through a fairly lengthy atheist phase from his teens, as many people do who are raised Christian. You get all angsty in your teens, you become an atheist. For some of us, it sticks. For Lewis, he went back to Christianity in his early 30s. But it's pretty interesting to... when I was working on the book, I was looking at his diary. He kept a diary during his atheist phase, and it's quite interesting to see the sort of atheist Lewis. I think most of his published stuff is, Christian Lewis, and so it's kind of interesting to see the contrast between the public, well-known Lewis, and then Lewis when he was in this atheist phase. So yeah, I respect him for those reasons. I think he also has some interesting arguments. So in the book and in the class, what I'm trying to do is, even though I disagree with Lewis on the biggest questions, I suppose, is to try to illustrate that he's worth taking seriously, and he's a figure that often seen as a popularizer, and I think especially so-called professional philosophers often sort of look down their noses at Lewis, which I think is a bit of a mistake. And so that was kind of the on the one hand, he's worth taking seriously, thinking about a lot of virtues, and at the same time trying to expose what I see some of the weaknesses in his argument. So that's the idea of both the class and the book, which kind of go together. The book arose from the teaching of the class.
Wow. Okay. I'm a massive Lewis fan, and I class myself as a non-theist. I think that, as you already mentioned, what I find so fascinating about Lewis, and I've said this before on the podcast, is that he really was an atheist. He kind of reluctantly came to Christianity through sort of discovery and reflection and argumentation. So maybe in the future, Professor Wielenberg, we'll have to get you back on to talk about Lewis and Hume and Bertrand Russell, as you mentioned as well. That'd be a really cool conversation, I think.
Yeah, I would love that. I think it's super interesting. And just one other thing about it is, especially with Lewis and Hume, there are a number of places in Lewis's writing where, even though he doesn't really mention Hume by name, it's pretty clear that he is responding to Hume. So there are all these sort of fascinating, when you read them side by side, it sort of pops out at you that even though he doesn't say I'm responding to Hume, he pretty clearly is. And so I think there are a lot of interesting connections to explore there.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating you mentioned that. I didn't realize that his book Miracles was based on kind of Hume's classic argument about miracles and kind of what would constitute as good enough evidence for a miracle. So it's really interesting. I kind of came to Miracles, kind of reading the sort of reason part of it as well as the miracle part of it, and then kind of read Hume afterwards. And it was it's almost like kind of reading back into it, kind of what Hume said, having never come to it before. I don't know. It was fascinating. I really, really enjoyed that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, last thing on this topic, I think there's a similar, so in Miracles, Lewis does actually mention Hume there. So that I guess is more of a clue that he's got Hume in mind. But there's another case like that where I think Lewis's book, The Problem of Pain, when you look at the way Lewis presents the challenge that he's trying to answer, it's strikingly similar to the way Hume presents it in this book that Hume wrote called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. So you have this, I think in both cases, like Miracles and The Problem of Pain, the books kind of stand on their own. But then when you see the Hume connection, it kind of makes it richer to see that he really is like directly, I think, addressing Hume's arguments.
Yeah, okay, that's one we should definitely book in a couple of months' time. Otherwise, we'll just completely derail this conversation, which is quite funny. Okay, so obviously you've kind of taught, you've written, you've thought a lot about kind of ethics, morality, virtue, value, these sorts of things. It would be good to kind of just get a bit of an overview, a kind of like where this started from for you. Like, what was it that began you down this journey of kind of exploring, I guess, moral realism within a sort of non-religious framework? Kind of what was it that kicked it off, and then what did that sort of work look like for you subsequently?
Yeah, so I didn't set out to be the like ethics without God guy, but I guess that's how it turned out. And I think the book that I think we're gonna perhaps talk about the most here, Value and Virtue in a Godless Universe, was actually the beginning. And I should maybe mention I was realizing I was it was in the summer of 2003, so 21 years ago, this summer that I wrote most of that book. And it started in a very simple way, which is I found myself thinking that atheism was, probably true. And then I found myself thinking that it seemed like probably there was objective morality. And I encountered the work of William Lane Craig, who, as I'm sure you and perhaps your audience are aware, is a prominent Christian philosopher. and gets a lot of mileage out of making the case that if there is no God, there cannot be objective morality. And to be honest, I hadn't really sort of thought too much about whether those, it just sort of struck me that atheism and objective morality could go together just fine. And so it was kind of refreshing to see Craig. I think one thing about Craig, he too, like Lewis, is a very clear, direct writer. And so he was really challenging that combination of views. And so that sort of motivated me to, I mean, I felt like Craig's arguments were probably mistaken, but I wanted to, think it through and sort of work out how objective morality and atheism could fit together. And so really it was Craig and trying to respond to Craig's arguments that really kicked it all off. And this book, Value and Virtue in a Godless Universe, was kind of the first effort I'd made in that vein, and I guess you could say it escalated from there. I've got a more recent book that's just called Robust Ethics, which in many ways is kind of I guess fancier version of Value and Virtue. It's not just a repeat, but it goes back to some of those topics, I think, in perhaps a deeper way. But yeah, that's how it all got started.
Interesting, really interesting. I know as well. You've had a fascinating debate with William Lane Craig. I'll make sure that's linked in the description. And there's also like a kind of response book, I think, based on that debate. Unless there's another debate that I'm not aware of, but that's a really cool book as well, where like philosophers from all sort of walks of life come in to specifically look at the two sorts of cases that you and William Lane Craig are putting forward. I thought that was a really, really cool piece of work.
Yeah, I'm glad you say that. I think the book turned out well. So like you say, it is based on that debate. So there's a transcript of the debate, including the Q&A. And then you have essays by philosophers who are sort of, I guess you would say, on my side, some of them, and then some on Craig's side. And then there's a final attempt to sort of sum up by Craig and I. So I think the book turned out well, and I agree it's pretty cool to see all the different perspectives, and then it's sort of an opportunity for Craig and I to get in one more word to kind of continue the debate a bit.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. It's really cool. Well, listener, viewer, everything that we've spoken about just now will be linked in the description, so make sure you check it out. Okay, Professor Wielenberg, it would be good to dive into some of the kind of questions kind of arising from your work then around sort of value and virtue, ethics, moral realism, etc. So I'd like to kind of, I guess, put the pieces in for those who might not be familiar to this sort of subject, so they can begin to understand what it would look like for there to be value and virtue without the idea of a deity of any description, whether that be Christian or whatever. So I think it'd be good. I guess the first piece I'd like to put on the table really is around sort of kind of ethical facts. How do you think we should kind of understand or think about ethical facts? Are they reducible to physical or scientific facts, or would it make sense to think of them more as kind of abstract Platonic properties maybe that we come into contact with? Like, how do you begin to look at ethical facts?
Yeah, so I would say maybe a way to think of it is to think of like ethical or moral features or properties. And I do think, so these would be things like, the property or the feature of being morally right, which I guess is a feature that actions could have. Moral obligation would be another one. And then being good, being bad or evil, those would be other moral or ethical features. And I think, so the ethical facts would just be the facts of various things, having those features. So a classic fun example that philosophers always talk about when they talk about objective morality, torturing a baby just for fun. There's an action, a particular person on a particular occasion performing that act. And I think most people would say, if there is real rightness and wrongness at all, that act would have the feature or property of moral wrongness. And so I think then the question is, well, what sort of property is this? And as you might imagine, there's a lot of disagreement about, one, are these features even real? If they are, what kind of features are they? And so my view is that these ethical or moral features or properties of things they're in their own category, they're their own type of thing, so that they are not reducible to or identical with like physical properties or properties that could be, studied through the empirical sciences. So if somebody's, torturing a baby just for fun, I don't think the wrongness of that action can be studied empirically or detected, in some scientific or empirical way. And so they are, the view I hold is these days often called, ethical or moral non-naturalism. And it's a sort of in between, I guess, a reductive view, which would say that the moral features just are like physical or natural features of things. And then perhaps a theistic view, which would want to say, at least in some cases, that the ethical or moral features of things are some sort of supernatural or divine feature. So just to mention one concrete example of that, a theory that I discuss quite a bit in my work is so-called divine command theory. And some divine command theorists would say for an act to be obligatory just is for it to be commanded by God. And sometimes that's understood as a sort of reductive view where the obligatoriness of the action is nothing more than the fact that action has been commanded by God. So yeah, I tend to think that these like, rightness, wrongness, or it being the sort of oughtness that you ought to do a certain thing seems to be a property that it's in its own category. It's not natural in the sense of being physical or able to be studied by the empirical sciences. I don't think it's supernatural like a feature of God either. So it's in a third category. So people in that camp, again, use this terminology of it's a non-natural feature or property.
Interesting. I guess on divine command theory, I'm kind of got a plan for us to dive a little bit into Euthyphro's dilemma in due course. I think it might be cool to chat about sort of kind of the difference between objective extrinsic and objective intrinsic. So people can very often understand kind of what it means for an ethical fact to be objective and extrinsic. So that's outside of themselves. So we've already spoken about something like divine command theory would kind of account for that. But often people get quite confused and quite, I guess, skeptical when we begin to talk about kind of objective ethical facts being intrinsic, held within us. There might be a bad way to describe it, but would you mind kind of helping us to understand the differences between these two and how something can be objective and intrinsic?
Yeah, maybe I can ask a clarifying question if that's okay. So I speak a lot. There's in philosophy, a distinction is often drawn between like intrinsic and extrinsic value, like intrinsic or extrinsic goodness and evil. Is that along the lines of what you're thinking of?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I'm going to dive into value a little bit more in the next question. So yeah, you're on the right track.
Okay. Yeah. So there, I think maybe backing up a bit might be helpful just to say a bit about just like objective morality and what that is sort of all about. And I mean, for me, I guess I think the simplest way to put it is if we say that back to this fun example of, you've got some guy torturing a baby just for fun. And, someone who believes in objective morality would say, well, not only is that action wrong, what the person is doing, but the wrongness of the act is independent of human minds and cultural practices and so on in a particular way. So, I think it's helpful to, in thinking of objectivity, it's helpful to actually start with just like physical facts, even though I think ethical facts are not physical facts. I think if you're trying to understand objectivity, physical facts are a good place to start. So if you've got, so I'm sitting here, there's a computer sitting on the desk, and I think it's an objective fact that the computer's on the desk. So if I went crazy and thought there was no computer, or even if all human beings were wiped out in a way that did not disturb the computer would still be there. So the fact of the computer being there, it's not true because we all think it's true. It's not socially constructed or something like that. It's this fact that's, as you often said, out there in the world. And so I think if you've got a guy torturing babies just for fun, there's a fact of that act being wrong, and that the wrongness of that act is independent of human beliefs and practices. In a similar way, if we all went nuts and thought that baby torture for fun was acceptable, we would just be mistaken. in the same way that people who think the Earth is flat, I think, are objectively mistaken. So hopefully that gives a sense of objectivity. And then I think the intrinsic extrinsic distinction exists within the I guess you could say the realm of objective morality. And I think the simplest way to think of it is intrinsic value or goodness or badness is just the value or goodness that a thing has in and of itself. It doesn't depend on the value or goodness is not dependent upon or derived from anything outside of itself. So many people think that like pleasure would be good in this way. If someone is having a feeling of pleasure, that in itself is just good. It doesn't depend on anything else for its goodness. On the flip side, pain is a common example of like an intrinsic evil. If you just sort of imagine a weird universe where all it is one guy in agony, that seems bad. And so the badness seems to exist just within the situation itself. Whereas if you think of something like, say, money, which does seem to be valuable, but it's only valuable because of what you can do with it or how it's related to other things, maybe its consequences. If you imagine a universe that just has nothing but a guy and a stack of cash, that doesn't seem actually particularly valuable because you can't really do anything with the cash. So looking at that, I think a lot of philosophers would say, something like pleasure would be intrinsically good. It carries its goodness within itself. Whereas something like money, it may be good, but it's only going to have extrinsic goodness. Its goodness depends on how it's related to other things, like what you could buy with it, for example.
Interesting. So it's almost like it's utility that grants it the goodness or badness, essentially. And a kind of way that I thought about kind of, I guess, morality before being objective is almost, and this is kind of for those more into kind of tech stuff, is kind of when you kind of action a line of code in a program, it could be even Microsoft Word or whatever it is. Basically, that's going to go and look at a database table, kind of work out kind of where these kind of subsets sit, and then it's going to kind of initialize those two things together, kind of point to it, go, yep, that's correct, and then kind of move on with its next action and line of code. And I kind of view sometimes, I don't know if this is helpful, sometimes morality is that as we perform actions, there is something that's outside of ourselves that we reference to know whether the thing we are doing is good or bad. But then there's kind of a challenge within this kind of view, something you've spoken to about with William Lane Craig around kind of almost the discovery of that database table, or the discovery of morality. We could use something like slavery as an example. Obviously, most people around the world today, not everybody sadly, but most think that slavery is abhorrent. That hasn't always been the case, and still isn't the case in certain circumstances in certain parts of the world. How would you begin to kind of, I guess, pick apart and kind of defend the idea that kind of, even though it is discoverable, morality can still be objective? Like, where would you begin to go down that road?
Yeah. So I think, I guess one thing I would say there is, I think the idea of morality being discoverable, kind of how to put it, that idea that it's discovered rather than, say, created, I think fits nicely with the idea that it is objective. So if we think that as humanity sort of increasingly comes to believe that slavery is wrong, that morality isn't really changing, but rather our beliefs are getting closer to the truth. It's a discovery rather than a changing of morality. I think that way of looking at it fits best with the idea that the morality is to some extent objective. It's sort of on the model of as human beings sort of move from thinking that the earth is flat to thinking that it's round, the shape of the earth is not changing. We're just getting closer to the truth. It's a discovery of the correct shape of the earth. So I guess that's one point I would want to make. Morality as the idea of moral discovery, I think, fits best with morality being objective. And then I guess another question is, like, I suppose related, is like, how does this discovery occur? Or you might flip it around and like, what was the problem? Like, what was sort of wrong with people when slavery was, as in many past civilizations, has been widely practiced. And I think in the particular case of slavery, the answer really kind of takes us into psychology, in particular this phenomenon that's called dehumanization. And there's one scholar in particular who has done a lot of work on dehumanization. His name is David Livingston Smith. He's got at least 2 books on dehumanization. And the basic idea is if you want to engage in slavery and see yourself as being justified in doing so, the sort of mental trick you've got to pull off is to convince yourself that the people you're enslaving are not truly people. They're not genuinely human, but rather even though they might appear to be human, their inner nature is a sort of subhuman essence or something like that, so that their true nature is different from that of real human beings, which of course includes, you and your friends or city state or whatever ethnic group, as the case may be. And so I think in that case, what really has happened is the sort of scam of dehumanization has been exposed. And it's just gotten harder for people to sincerely engage in this kind of dehumanization. What the true discovery is, I could put it this way. I think everybody would agree it's wrong to enslave persons or human beings or something like that. And maybe that principle hasn't really changed. What's changed is the recognition that, all human beings are persons. And so that's actually where the discovery lies, the extending or the recognition that this inner essence of humanity really includes all of Homo sapiens rather than just a particular in-group or ethnic group. Like the Greeks, for example, notoriously divided Homo sapiens into like the Greeks and the barbarians, and only the Greeks were real persons. And I think what's been recognized is that frankly is kind of silly. And you have a similar story with along racial lines, like in the American South, for example. So I think in that case, what you might call the discovery is really the discovery that we're all human beings and have the same basic nature. And the sort of it's become less and less plausible or feasible to sort of get away with dehumanization, if that makes sense.
No, that's really interesting. This is going to be a slight tangent and a kind of a weird question. I can imagine there's a theist or two listening who are kind of, just saying, well, isn't it surprising that we've become to slowly discover that morality points towards positivity and good things, when on a naturalistic framework, morality, it could have been good for us to enslave people. Actually, we could have gone and discovered something else, but actually morality seemed to be imbibing goodness rather than kind of arbitrary directions such as slavery or whatever it is that's good for some people groups and bad for other people groups. How would you begin to kind of address a kind of criticism like that about the discoverability of morality kind of bringing us into theoretically better and better positions?
Yeah. So if I can maybe clarify, is the question like,
sure.
Is it sort of along the lines of on theism, it's maybe unsurprising or to be expected that this sort of discovery as time passes, you would expect our moral thinking to sort of improve, whereas maybe there's no particular reason to expect that on naturalism. Is that the sort of thing you're thinking?
Yeah, so I think it is, and I think the sort of place, just to kind of really hammer it home, then you can respond, the place that the theist would be coming from is there is obviously somebody instantiating a moral direction or an imperative to go to this place, which is, bliss. Whereas somebody would say that kind of a naturalistic version of that sort of kind of sets of what morality is in the Platonic realm or wherever it is, it's almost set arbitrarily. Like it doesn't necessarily have to go to a sort of utopia. Mm-hmm. So why is it kind of moving in that direction, I guess? I hope that helps a little bit as well.
Yeah, good. I do think one thing that's I think, right about that way of looking at it is I don't really think there's any inevitability or necessity. Let's stay with the case of slavery. I don't see there being inevitability or necessity in what I think most people would see as an improvement in moral thinking. I think you could imagine a world where slavery sort of persisted and this at least somewhat diminishment of dehumanization occurred. So I think in some sense, on the naturalistic view, it was and is a kind of accident. So just to say a bit more, like, why did it happen? Well, I think part of the story, it's going to be a complicated story, but I think part of the story is what is nowadays called globalization, where through trade and so on, as you have more interaction across different groups, and people are sort of, for one reason or another, they just come to recognize that even though these people look different and they speak a different language, at the end of the day, they are a lot like us. And so they are people. Like if you're trading with people and sort of get to know them, it's just psychologically harder and harder to like hold on to the belief that there's some kind of subhuman, pest or something like that. That didn't have to happen. I think that's just the way things went. But I guess one thing that, the naturalist can at least has a kind of explanation, like, okay, just historically, because of like trade and globalization, that's what caused this change to occur. It's not built into reality that it had to occur, but there's a story as to why it did occur. I suppose another thought I would have is you might sort of turn things around, which is like on the theistic view, if you're saying, okay, you would expect God would move us toward this moral truth. I mean, a question you might ask, though, is why did he make it take so long, right? So it's almost like if on the theistic view you would anticipate slavery being diminished, you might also say, yeah, wouldn't you also anticipate it never catching on in the first place, right? So I suppose a question or challenge for the theist could be, why did God allow humans to engage in this dehumanization and the practice of slavery for so long, rather than cluing us in from the beginning, or at least more quickly, or something like that?
I want to invite you to join our community on Locals. There is a range of free and supporter-only benefits to check out. On Locals, you can ask guest questions, access the reading plan to prepare for upcoming conversations, get early access to all the full-length video and audio versions of each episode, and meet like-minded followers of the show. The link is in the description, and I hope to see you there. Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, you could kind of look at kind of other hominin before us and that were kind of with us for a little bit and then have disappeared. And Neanderthal is in some individuals' DNA at least. There's somewhere from between 1% and 4%. I'm not sure what it is, but it's a very low percentage. Obviously, kind of there's reproduction that's happening, but also there's the extinction of an entire species. And then the other hominin, you can look at Homo erectus or whoever else. We were living alongside these for a while, and then they just went out. Or you look at the sort of megafauna over in Australia, right? A lot of that died pretty much instantly as soon as humans settled and set fire to the forest. It is fascinating kind of how the development of morality has taken place and the fact that we have landed where we are, and it might go backwards as well as forwards. I think we always think we're progressing to some utopia, but it doesn't necessarily hold, which is terrifying at the same time.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think that's an important point. It's not, it's probably not, I mean, historically, it hasn't been really a story of steady progress, and yeah, it's a bit alarming, and it certainly can go backwards. There's no guarantee that the moral progress that's been made will stick.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about necessary truths then. So I'm going to quote you from your book in just a second. We can chat about that quote. So In the book, you make the following claim, quote, "The foundation of morality is a set of axiomatic, necessary ethical truths. No being, natural or supernatural, is responsible for the truth or has control over these ethical truths." End of quote. So I guess most theists would obviously balk at this idea, as we've already kind of begun to unpick, the idea of axiomatic, necessary ethical truths being outside of a sort of divinely instilled moral framework. So I can imagine a response from a theist being, "Professor Wielenberg, you're just mistaken. Kind of what you're claiming to be a natural set of axiomatical truths is actually God, and you've just missed the boat. Basically, you've just kind of or you've mislabeled something that happens to be there." How would you kind of respond and kind of say, no, really, this isn't God? Like, what, I guess, what evidence is there to suggest that this isn't some sort of divinely held set of axiomatical truths?
Yeah. So I think one argument that I have pressed that's relevant to this goes basically like this. Sometimes the theistic approaches to objective morality, they're described or they're billed as providing a complete foundation or explanation of objective morality, where God is at the source of everything. And I try to make the case that when you look at these systems carefully, what you end up finding is there's always at least one moral axiom in there. And what I mean by that is when you look carefully at the details of these theistic approaches that are sometimes described as grounding all of morality in God, what they do in fact is they ground most of morality in God, but in order to accomplish that grounding, they make use of some moral fact or axiom, I would call it, that is not based in God and just sort of seems to be hanging there. I can give an example perhaps in a minute, but if I'm right about this, what it means is that really someone like me and the theist are actually playing the same game, which is to say we're both appealing to at least one moral axiom that is just there. And I think some of the, at least as you were saying in that passage, are necessary truths, which simply means not only are they true, but they had to be true. It's impossible for them to be false. So I suppose as perhaps an illustration of the kind of thing I'm talking about on the theistic side, maybe I could mention the version of divine command theory developed by Robert Adams. He has a book called Finite and Infinite Goods, which is, I think, the most sophisticated version of divine command theory ever. It's quite extensive and developed and so on. But when he is in the course of developing that theory, there are places where he appeals to what seem to be ethical claims, facts, which are just sort of there. They're not made true by God. They seem to be sort of floating free, I suppose you would say. So, for example, one of those would be, he says that if a commander who is very good, has like a good character, tells you to do something, that gives you a strong reason to do that thing. And he uses that claim and others to support his divine command theory. But that claim itself, which asserts this connection between the commander is good, therefore you've got a reason to obey a command from that commander, that seems to be a kind of ethical or at least normative fact. It's, telling you you've got a reason to do something in certain circumstances. But that is not grounded in God on Adam's theory. He just helps himself to it. And my point here is not that there's really anything problematic about that or that claim is implausible. It seems like a perfectly reasonable moral axiom. The crucial point is it functions as a moral axiom in his system. And so what that means is, again, he and I are playing the same game. We start with moral axioms, and then we use those to to develop a theory of objective morality. And so it's just not really accurate to say that, like, on Adam's view, all of the ethical truths are grounded in God. Some of them are, but others are just there and are sort of free floating, not based in God. And so it's no good for the theist to say, hey, Wielenberg, you can't help yourself to these moral axioms that are just sort of there, because that's exactly what I think the theist approaches to morality are doing as well. Now, you got to sort of get into the nitty gritty and make this case argument on a case by case basis. But there's one example of, in the case of Adams, how I think he is just using an axiom that he thinks is sort of just there and not based in God.
Very interesting. Maybe we can come at this from another angle then. If we go back to the sort of database analogy, so we could kind of say that kind of we are kind of programs performing certain sets of actions. Obviously, we're limited in our capacity, so we can do certain things, we can't do other things. As those actions are instantiated within us, we kind of reference a table, which is kind of, I guess we call it this sort of ethical framework table. Now, I don't think this would say kind of something like rape is wrong. Like, it wouldn't be as specific as that, but it could be along the lines of kind of, causing other conscious creatures physical bodily harm isn't okay because, and it could go into sort of kind of, whatever, kind of more, I guess, conscious well-being fundamentals. That's kind of how I would begin to view that sort of database table, as more the fundamentals and the specific propositions of this is wrong and that is right. The sort of question then kind of comes time and time again is, whenever I speak to a theist, looking at someone like Joshua Rasmussen, or I'm hoping to speak to Richard Swinburne in a couple of months' time, these individuals would claim that you need the simplest explanation for why there is this database table, if we want to keep going with that analogy, which is going to enable us to reference as and when we perform a certain programmable function within our lives. And they would argue, obviously, that kind of that needs to be a sort of all-powerful, all-loving, omni-whatever God. And without that, you have these kind of really sort of fundamentally important to human well-being and flourishing sets of properties that are just there, but could arbitrarily snap out of existence tomorrow, theoretically. So kind of how are these things, obviously this isn't a question you can actually answer, but it's good to kind of put the cards on the table and explain it as far as we can. Like, how did that get instantiated, and what stops that from just vanishing before our eyes?
Yeah, and to clarify, you're referring to like the database. Like, how is it that there's this database is there? And right. So I think in terms of the database analogy, again, for me, an important point is I think to realize that the theists, part of their system, part of the database is just there, and then try to use God to sort of flesh it out. That's another way of putting this point that, like, both the theist and I are appealing to some moral axioms. So this is why I think, I think the database analogy is helpful. Sometimes the way the debate is presented is the theist says, well, look, on the theist view, there's the database isn't just there. God creates it or comes up with it. Whereas on your view, like Wielenberg, we just somehow have this database like magically already in reality, to which my response is the theist view too has part of the database already there. So again, it's the idea that there's this deep difference between the theist approach and my approach, I think in that regard is a mistake. We're both committed to saying, like, somehow at least part of the database is just there. Just briefly, since you mentioned Swinburne is an interesting case because he actually thinks that at least some of the ethical truths are necessary truths, in particular truths about obligation, for example. And so he's one theist who isn't really a fan of the sort of William Craig style moral argument that says without God there would be no obligation. Swinburne actually agrees with me, I think, about obligation, that there are just these necessary truths that are just sort of there. So I guess it's worth pointing out that, I mean, Swinburne is sort of comes out and emphasizes this, I think other theists like Adams, and I think even Craig, when you look closely at Craig's version of divine command theory, Craig doesn't want there to want it. He doesn't. He's trying to avoid the idea that part of the database is already there, but I think it's in there when you look closely at what is going on. So again, for me, with the data in terms of this database analogy, it's just not true that on the theist approaches, God creates the entire database. Really, what's going on is somehow part of the database is there, and then maybe God fills it in. But then again, that makes it very similar to what I'm up to, which is, at least part of the database is there, and then maybe other factors fill it in. So again, there's not this deep difference. It's a kind of illusion to think that, like, on the theist side, God creates the whole database.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know many theists would probably begin to push in further and say it's not that God creates the database, it's that God's character is the database, and it's from that character that everything's substantiated. I'm not sure it's worth pushing further into that, but Professor Wielenberg, what are your thoughts? Is it worth addressing that one as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you say is right. That is a common sort of theist idea, and I think that relates to if we get into the Euthyphro problem at some point, which seems inevitable if we're talking about God and morality, to maybe touch on the Euthyphro problem. But I think, again, if we think of a view like Adams, it's true that Adams thinks that part of the database just is, or is somehow, maybe he uses the language of constitution, part of the database is constituted by God's character. But still, he has these claims that, like, if a good commander tells you to do something, that's a reason to do it. Or if you owe a big debt of gratitude to someone and they tell you to do something, that gives you a reason to do what they say. Those aren't part of God's character. Those are not made true by God's commands. They're just there. And so, again, those would be things that are already in the database, independently of God, on Adam's particular approach.
We've mentioned it a few times now, so it'd be good to dive into Euthyphro's dilemma. I guess it'd be good to address it in the vein of sort of permissibility and impermissibility. There's a sort of common trope within religious circles that without God, anything is permissible. And I can kind of understand how an internal arbiter of justice would instill moral obedience, but still at the same time, people go too far when they claim that this moral arbiter is needed to instantiate morality. And this obviously hits upon Euthyphro's dilemma. So I'd love to get your take on kind of how this is addressed, or I guess utilized in pushing against sort of divine command theory of theistic moral instantiation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one thing I would say is, I think it's very helpful in debates about ethics and God to try to push beyond the Euthyphro dilemma. This is a bit of a hobby horse of mine, that because here's the thing, the theists have been thinking about that thing for like 2,000 years, and they've come up with some pretty interesting responses to the Euthyphro problem. This is just, I guess, a warm up before I say a bit about what the problem is. I say this because I think on the non-theist side, the Euthyphro is often rolled out as like the devastating, unanswerable objection to theistic approaches to morality, particularly divine command theory. And I think that's not correct, because there are, again, the theists have been working on that one for a while, and they've got some interesting responses. So that's more the beginning of the debate, not the end, as it's sometimes presented, at least on the non-theist side. But to kind of go through it roughly, so as I'm sure you and your listeners may know, it goes back to this dialogue by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, and there's this character Euthyphro, and the question of the dialogue is what is piety? And at a certain point, so the one thing is that in the context of the Euthyphro, they were thinking in a polytheistic framework, so they spoke of the gods rather than God. But at one point in this discussion, Socrates and Euthyphro have this discussion, and at one point the question is posed: are pious things pious because the gods love them, or do the gods love the pious things because they are pious? Which can be thought of as a kind of chicken and egg type problem. It's like which comes first, the thing being pious or the thing being loved by the gods? And so now, in the contemporary scene, the debates between, often Christian theists and non-theists, we've moved to a monotheistic context. And so the question sort of gets reformulated. Let's put it in terms of permissibility, as I think you suggested. So suppose we've got all these actions that are morally permissible or morally right. It's morally okay to do those things. Are they permissible because God makes them permissible? Or does the permissibility come first, and then God has some attitude toward them? I suppose with the youth, to pose the problem, it's actually makes the most sense to think in terms of obligation and God's commands. This is the way it's typically formulated. So there the question becomes, we've got all these actions that are morally obligatory. Well, what comes first, the actions being obligatory or God commanding them? So do we have a situation where sort of before God does anything, you have these actions that are already obligatory, and then God sees that, and then he tells human beings to do them because they're already obligatory? Or is it the other way around, where before God does anything, there is no obligation, maybe just all actions are neutral or something like that, and then God commands certain ones, and then they become morally obligatory? And the basic challenge or the so-called problem is that from the perspective of divine command theory, it seems the divine command theorist has to say that the commands of God come first. If the action, before God does anything, if the action is already obligatory, that seems to be incompatible with divine command theory. The core idea of divine command theory is that the commands make them obligatory. So the divine command theorist is committed to the view that says God's commands come first, and then that's what makes the acts obligatory. And at least one common version of the Euthyphro problem says, okay, if that's the case, then God could have, in principle, commanded anything. He could have commanded these horrible actions, and in that case, they would have been morally obligatory. But that seems crazy, so there must be something wrong with divine command theory. That's kind of the simplest way of putting it. And again, I think this is a beginning rather than this is not the death blow to divine command theory. So a very common response to this on the theist side, and this connects back to God's character that you were mentioning before, is to say, even though the commands come first, and that's what makes the acts obligatory, what God can command is constrained by his perfect character. So there's this sort of saying, a cliche. If a person is very honest, you might say, he's so honest, he could not tell a lie. And similarly, one way of understanding the theist response to the Euthyphro problem is the objector, the defender of the Euthyphro challenge, is saying, for example, God could have commanded rape or something, and then it would have been obligatory. That seems crazy. Rape could never be obligatory, so divine command theory can't be true. And in a nutshell, the theist response is God is so loving, he could never command rape. And so even though the theist wants to say the commands come first and which acts are obligatory completely depends on God's commands, nevertheless, it does not follow that anything could have been obligatory, because God it's part of his nature, essence, to have this particular character. And given his character, there are some commands that he simply cannot make.
It's such an interesting...
And I think this is an interesting response. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's such an interesting response and way of viewing it. I think most people come to the Euthyphro dilemma and kind of think, well, that's it, done and dusted. But there are certain ways that kind of theists, as already mentioned, begin to push against it and try and dodge it at the same time. I don't know, kind of. I feel like it's one of those dilemmas which is going to be there forever. Like there's no way to overcome it. But at the same time, I kind of feel like it's almost phrasing the problem incorrectly to create a dilemma rather than there actually being a dilemma. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that side of it?
Well, the it is a timeless classic, so I don't think it's going away. But again, I mean, to me, that response that I just sketched, whether it works or not, it's got to be dealt with, right? And so the thing that that somewhat drives me up the wall is on frankly the non-theist side, when the Euthyphro dilemma is presented as death blow, debate over divine command theory is decisively refuted. But to me, it's more like the first move in a series of of moves that can go back and forth. I think it's unlikely to go away just because it's simple. The sort of history and tradition of it goes back to Plato. I mean, that always gives things, I think, staying power in philosophy. But for me, my big thing is just it's an opening move. I don't think it's the end of the story. So, I mean, one of the things I've tried to do is sort of develop other challenges, objections to divine command theory. And so, I mean, just one sort of idea, which is a very simple idea. Maybe I'll just mention it. I think one mistake that divine command theory makes is basically, I think the correct view of obligation is that obligations have many different sources. Some of our obligations are just based in values, certain things being good or evil. Other obligations may be based in relationships. So if you're in a marriage, you have certain moral obligations in virtue of being in that relationship. And it seems to me that what has sort of gone wrong with divine command theory is commands can be one source of moral obligation. There are certainly situations where you have a kind of hierarchy and there's someone who has authority over another person. And if they possibly, some parents and children, if they give a command or tell the person below that they have authority over to do something, that can create a moral obligation to do that thing. I think to me, the error of divine command theory is just thinking that's how all moral obligations work. And so if there's going to be moral obligation at all, you got to have this ultimate commander who's going to be God. And that's just the same kind of mistake as if you thought, well, all obligations are derived from promises. And so if nobody ever made any promises, there would be no moral obligations. I think that would be a mistake. Without promising, like murder would still be wrong for different reasons. And I think the same is true of commands. They're one source of obligation, but it's just a mistake to think that they're the only source of obligations. I think murder is wrong for reasons that have nothing to do with anyone telling you not to murder. And if you're in a marriage, you get certain obligations just by being in that relationship, which again are independent of there being some like third person who tells you, has to tell you, what you should do when you're married or something like that. So one way of thinking of divine command theory is it's a kind of just overgeneralization. It's a mistake of thinking that one source of moral obligation is the only possible source of moral obligation. And so if you take away this big commander God, all obligation goes with it. Just seems to be a mistake. There are other sources of moral obligation that would still be there even if God were not in the picture. So that's one. I mean, that's pretty simple argument. I think it's correct, but that's just an example of one kind of argument that it really has nothing to do with the Euthyphro problem. It's a challenge to divine command theory that's not connected, I think, to the Euthyphro worries.
No, it's fascinating. It really is fascinating. And I kind of like what you said as well before about Euthyphro's dilemma, which is simply that it's the starting piece. It's like you've set the board up with the chess pieces and then you can begin to play with it to see
Yeah.
where the game goes, rather than it's you killing the king. That isn't what it is. I totally agree.
Yeah. It's not checkmate, right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Okay, there's a few kind of side tangents I want to go down before we kind of dive into a little bit more of this stuff. So there's a bit in your book where you speak about the idea that somebody who believes in God can't necessarily truly give themselves up and relinquish their life fully for another. I put a quote out on Twitter a little while ago about this and got some interesting responses to it. I think it'd be interesting to kind of get you to dive into that idea a little bit more about the actual fully enablement of giving up one's life for another, to sacrifice yourself and to go to death for the sake of another is only truly fully sacrificial if naturalism's true and you're holding that as you go into that sacrifice. I don't know, could you spell that out just a little bit more for us?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a chapter in the book where I focus on a lot of issues that relate to this theistic concept of, I think I call it like, I wrote the book so long ago, I made some notes. I was rereading my book and made some notes to remind myself. Yeah, in the book I call this the divine guarantee of perfect justice, which I think is a familiar idea within Christianity. In a nutshell, it's just the idea that in the long run, the long run is going to include an afterlife. Everyone will get exactly what they deserve. And I think on the theist view, well, for anyone that this can seem to be an attractive idea, I think many people would agree. One of the very frustrating things about life is that it's not fair, as our parents often tell us. And when you look at, you sort of imagine zooming out and seeing the whole history of humanity, it seems like if all there is this life, earthly life, there's a lot of deep injustice. There are lots of terrible people getting away with terrible things and not really being punished. And at the same time, there are people who seem pretty decent and so on, and horrible things happen to them, and then that's it. And that injustice is sort of never addressed or fixed, you might say. And so this is, Craig makes a big deal out of the fact that on the theist view, everything will be made right in the end. In the afterlife, everyone will ultimately get what they deserve. And it's guaranteed because God is, in charge, is going to make sure this is going to happen. So on the theist view, it can seem attractive, like nobody is really going to get away with things in the long run. God will always catch you and make sure that you get what you deserve. And so I think Craig and some others try to use this idea actually as a sort of argument for theism. So the point that you were mentioning in your question so the point I make in the book is, okay, suppose for the sake of argument, we are in this theistic universe where we have this divine guarantee of perfect justice. On the one hand, nobody can sort of get away with anything. On the other hand, it makes, I think, what I call like genuine self-sacrifice actually becomes impossible, because any admirable sacrifice that you make, you're going to get rewarded for it. So it actually becomes sort of impossible to, overall in the long run, truly make yourself worse off for the sake of another person. So I think, the most dramatic cases would be cases where people sacrifice their life for the life of another person. And you might think, okay, well, that's a case where, it's a genuine sacrifice. Like, you've given up your life, you are worse off. You did it for this other person. It's very admirable, heroic, and so on. Problem is, on the theist view, it turns out not to be that heroic, because God is going to make sure that you're rewarded for it. And so it's like God actually makes it impossible to engage in a genuine self-sacrifice, because he's always going to reward you, which sort of prevents it then from being a true sacrifice, if that makes sense. So I think it's not so much the belief in God that's the problem. It's if God is there and this divine guarantee of perfect justice exists, it makes true self-sacrifice impossible. Whereas on the naturalist view, genuine self-sacrifice is possible. You can give your life up for someone else, make yourself truly worse off in the long run to benefit the other person. And so the point of this in the book is to suggest that it's actually kind of weird that on the theist view, this very admirable type of action becomes impossible. And just to sort of finish it off, the context is this argument on the theist side that says, without things being made right in the long run, there's this kind of moral absurdity that exists in the universe, which just is a way of referring to this deep injustice that never gets fixed, that just persists forever. And the philosopher who advances this argument uses the phrase moral absurdity to describe that. And so in the end, I was trying to sort of counter that argument and say, well, either way, there's going to be this kind of moral weirdness or absurdity in the universe. Either you get unfixed injustice that just persists, or you get this weird thing where it's impossible to truly sacrifice yourself for the sake of another person, which too seems kind of morally weird or absurd, I suppose. So that was kind of the point of that argument.
No, it's really helpful. You know, there are always two sides to every coin, and this kind of shows that really well. It's pretty cool. I guess it'd be useful then, just pushing on to talk about potential determinism. And how that plays into kind of like ethical frameworks and sort of theories. So the actions I take, I believe, are consequences of the world that I found myself within through no choice of my own. This includes my time and place, my brain chemistry at this very moment, even what word I choose to say next, and if I say it correctly. I often find myself being surprised by that taking place and going one way or the other. It's almost like tossing a coin. Anyway, we can kind of give more and more examples, so I won't do that. It'd be good to kind of understand how free will plays into sort of ethical facts and individual adherence to ethical ability.
Yeah. Let me first say, I think free will is a good candidate for the hardest problem in all of philosophy. That is, what is it? What would it take for people to have free will? And then, given the requirements of free will, does it exist in the universe? And so I do think that there's got to be some sort of free will for ethics to really make sense. I mean, the whole idea of you're morally required to do this and it would be wrong to do that and so on seems to presuppose you've at least got some options. Or at the very least, morality becomes super uninteresting if everyone only has one true option at any point. Then it does seem like, I mean, there's this principle in philosophy that a lot of people think is plausible, the so-called ought implies can principle, that you can't be morally obligated to do something that you're incapable of doing. And so if everyone can only do one thing at every point, then it seems like that would always be the morally required option. But then ethics becomes super uninteresting because everybody is always doing what they should. So it does seem like for ethics at least to be interesting, there's got to be some sort of free will. There have to be options. Now, how could that be? How could that work? Yeah, that's a hard question. I mean, the one thing I think can be said is that the current science does seem to suggest that there is some indeterminacy in the universe, which at least seems to leave room for the possibility of free will. There was a time when I think the sort of mainstream scientific view was more of a clockwork universe, which is more of a, harder to see how you could have what I would think of as real free will in a universe like that. I think that view, and this relates to like quantum physics and so on, I think that view has fallen out of favor, but there are still very difficult questions as to like, what would have to be going on in the brain in order for free will to be possible. But the other thing I would say about this is, in the book, the Value and Virtue in a Godless Universe book, one of the things I emphasize, I think is something you mentioned, which is that to a significant degree, we are the playthings of fortune, and I think, as you mentioned, this is something I make a big deal out of in the book. Each of us just is thrown into the world in a situation over which we have no control, and then we sort of go from there. And all you have to do is look around the world and think about the extreme range of circumstances that babies are thrown into when they arrive in the world for the first time, and combine that with the complete helplessness of human babies, and you can start to see how chance, fortune, circumstances outside of our control play a huge role in our opportunities, our fates, and so on. Now, all of that, I think, does leave room for free will. It's just that even if we have options and free will to some extent, that's all within the context of so much of what our lives are like, just being determined by things over which we have no control. That was kind of a lot. Hopefully it was responsive to your to your question.
If you're watching this, then I just wanted to let you know that you can access the same content in audio-only form by subscribing via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Audible. In fact, you can search for the Socratic Sessions in your favourite podcast app, and whilst you're there, please leave a 5-star review. It helps others to discover these conversations. All links are in the description, and thank you. No, it was great. It was great. I mean, I find it fascinating, right? If I'm trying to make a health life decision, want to get in shape, want to eat well, whatever it is, if I'm unaware of those things, I'm never going to be able to make that step forward. Like if I don't know about a certain diet and a certain way of working out that works with my preferences and my time zone and my abilities, etc., I'm not going to be able to make those steps. It's almost like there needs to be an accumulation of many, many factors to go somewhere. And if I was to be able to instill everything that I know now into Sam from 20 years ago, the decisions, the things that person will say, they won't be me, right? We are kind of, we are the property and the reality of the decisions we made previously. The whole free will space absolutely fascinates me. We won't dive too much more into it because I don't want to eat up all our time, but one to come back to one day on the show, I'm sure. Okay, there's this idea that I get presented to very often, mainly from atheists online, which is the idea that evil isn't a thing. There's sort of kind of a sliding scale between good and bad, and some things are kind of bad, some things are really bad, some things are kind of good, some things are really good, and it's all to do with my kind of preferences. Or we could then push it onto humanity and say kind of a well-being is the thing that we're using for this sliding scale. An example I've used once or twice with friends before probably is this idea that kind of it would be bad if I woke up every morning and shouted at my children because I'm grumpy and I'm groggy. I think it would be evil if I woke up every morning and tortured my children just for the joy of their screams, right? There seems to be a difference between these two things. And don't worry, I've never done that, just to make sure there's that caveat there as well.
I understand. Hypothetically, yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes I do when they're screaming at me in the morning. Oh my goodness, that's evil as well. Anyway, but it'd be interesting to kind of hear a little bit from you, Professor Wielenberg, about what evil looks like on a sort of naturalistic framework. Like, how do we begin to say, yes, this thing's happening here, rape, torture, murdering children, whatever it is, that this is evil? Because so many atheists don't want to allow those sorts of words to be within our vocabulary.
Okay, I guess clarifying question. So evil versus just bad. So are the atheists you're describing here, am I right? They would allow that maybe there are things that are bad, but what they resist is the idea of like evil in the world. Yeah. Um, I guess one question is what really hangs on this. I mean, maybe their thinking is like evil sounds, it sounds too religious, and they don't want to they don't want to allow any religious sounding stuff into reality. Um, but I guess I'm not, bad versus evil. To me, what is interesting is just the question of, can there be genuine value? So I don't know if there's badness but not evil. I guess I'm not. I don't feel super concerned to sort of argue against that. What I'm trying to resist is the sort of the theist view that says like there can't even be anything good or bad if you don't have God in the picture. Having said that, I guess I would think that a useful way to think of, if you're trying to understand what evil is and then make the case that there is evil even in a naturalistic world or a universe without God, would be to just think of paradigmatic examples of evil. So, when we think of evil, it's just sort of, the worst kinds of things that human beings can do. And it does seem to me that perhaps a component of evil is it, at least one form of it is like the intentional and sort of pointless or unjustified infliction of suffering. So when we think of, you can think of like, literature and film for these examples of sort of pure evil. So I think maybe like the Joker from the Batman series, who just wants to see the world burn. He's not like trying to do good things and is just screwing it up. He's intentionally trying to do terrible things. So the intentional pursuit of what the agent believes or knows to be bad maybe would be one form of evil. I think in Paradise Lost by Milton, the devil is portrayed in this way. He's got one of the devil's lines is "Evil, be thou my good," which seems the idea of which seems to be he's committing himself to the pursuit of evil intentionally in the way that most people would try to pursue good things. So he's the opposite of that. Or another character from literature might be the sort of horrifying character of Alex from A Clockwork Orange, who is described as knowing that he does evil things, but he gets pleasure out of doing the evil things. And so again, it's at least a knowledgeable, intentional pursuit of bad actions. So if I had to maybe cut to the chase, if you wanted me to, what's my case for the existence of evil in a naturalistic world? It would be simply, in a nutshell, it would be that one form of evil is intentionally doing bad things to other people. So it's not an accident. You're doing the bad thing. You're doing it on purpose. And I think that happens and can happen in a world without God. And so that would be one form of evil that would exist in a naturalistic universe.
Interesting. So I want to dive back into obligations and, pushing further into godless normative realism. It'd be good to use the example of the Joker, but in fact, no, let's do that now. We can jump to fear afterwards. So I guess, let's look here. So yeah, basically towards the end of your book, I've got another quote here. You say, quote, "Even in a naturalistic universe, each of us can help someone and we are obligated to make the attempt." End of quote. So I guess I'd like to talk about sort of moral motivation to actually instantiate or fulfill or live into those obligations placed upon us. We look at someone like the Joker, and they're obviously kind of like the complete opposite of good. They are going for evil, as we've already said, watching the world burn. That's going to be pushing against these kind of properties within the database. If we want to go back to that example again, that are providing the framework for these obligations to be passed down to individuals as they're living. So I guess kind of when you look at this, it'd be helpful to talk about the moral motivation that kind of pushes itself upon somebody for them to actually kind of bring it into fruition. I could be going out on the street later on today, or when I go down to London tomorrow morning, I could see a homeless person on the side of the road. There's going to be a moment within me where I'm like, should I buy them a hot drink? Should I buy them some food? Should I give them some money? Should I just walk on by? they're kind of, very minimal sort of moral decisions that I need to contend with, but there'll be something within me which takes one of those paths probably. And it's often quite hard to tell what it is that's kind of pushing me down that road. So would you mind kind of exploring, I guess, moral motivations upon individuals for these obligations to actually be instantiated within the world?
Yeah. So I'm gonna maybe a clarifying question one more time, if you'll bear with me. I think in philosophy, when people talk about reasons for action, let's say, unsurprisingly, there's a distinction is often drawn. Sometimes reason, it could be a reason in the psychological sense, so like a causal factor, or it could be a reason in what is sometimes called the normative sense. So a reason in the sense of something that should motivate you, whether it actually does or not. So let's take that case of encountering the homeless person, and suppose you feel, compassion for the person, and then that leads you to buy them a hot drink. I think that compassion or that feeling would be a reason in the psychological sense. It's a fact. It's a causal factor in your action. But then we might also wonder, okay, is there a normative reason, something about the situation that suggests that you ought to buy the person a hot drink? And I think in that case, there is a normative reason, and it has nothing to do with God. And it's simply the fact that, here's a human being who is suffering, and you can do something to alleviate the suffering. And that would be the sort of normative or moral reason to do it. I think perhaps I have more to say, but does that make sense? And maybe you, if you want to sort of follow up, and yeah.
Yeah, no, that's precisely it. I think both of these two things kind of work in tangent. I think you need to have a psychological reason to do something, but also there needs to be this normative case or proposition, which is what's pushing you into having and actually fulfilling that. It's almost like I view these things as a chain, right? We look at whatever the moral action is that we're taking down here to the left of me. You have this database or this set of kind of moral actions that we kind of check against and live against and utilize. And then you kind of move, I think the way that I view it is you move from that to the normative, to the psychological, to the action. And it's almost kind of like that causal link, like what makes that hold consistently? Like what brings that into us? I know it's an abstract question. It's a little bit woolly, but it's kind of what makes that moral decision to give the hot drink, to give food, to give money. Like all three of those things are instantiating back to this sort of database. They're all providing this individual with something. Kind of what makes that decision pull into one direction or another through that chain. I don't know. It's very woolly. I'm aware of that. So apologies.
Yes, all right. I'll maybe take a stab at saying something productive or useful. So I think the way I would think of it is, as we move through our lives, we're in situations that have various features, and some of those features I think basically are or provide us with normative reasons to do different things. In the book, I, for whatever reason, talk about this cheesecake example quite a bit, where so you've got a piece of cheesecake, and of course cheesecake is delicious and that gives you a reason to eat it. But then if you know that the cheesecake is also poisoned, then you've got this, I think, more compelling reason not to eat it. That has to do with normative reasons. So there are various features of, in this case, the cheesecake, that you might say, provide reasons or make certain courses of action more rational or sensible than others. And but then there's what we should do, and then there's what we do, right? And I think this connects to morality in that our obligations, moral obligations, ultimately depend on the reasons we have for doing things. Now, the cheesecake example, those are all what might be described as reasons of self-interest. So if the cheesecake is delicious, that gives me a reason to eat it. That's like a self-interested reason because I'll get pleasure. But if the cheesecake is poisoned, I've got a self-interested reason not to eat it. If it's strong enough poison, I'll die, let's say. And so in that case, if I know the cheesecake is poisoned, deadly poison, but I eat it anyway, I've acted irrationally or foolishly, in sort of a self-destructive way. I think where morality comes in is that we also have reasons to do things that involve other people, not just ourselves. So back to the homeless person case, if you can easily alleviate a person's suffering or some of their suffering by, say, buying them a hot drink, that's a strong normative reason to buy them the hot drink. It doesn't necessarily mean that you will do it. You might be indifferent and so on. And so there, in that case, in the cheesecake case, if you eat the poisoned cheesecake, your act is criticized as foolish or irrational. In the case where you don't help the person that you easily could, now we seem to have morality coming in, and your action seems, immoral or morally wrong, or you failed to fulfill a moral obligation that you had because of the situation that you were in. And I think ideally we want our actual motivations and actions to match up with the normative reasons of the situations that we find ourselves in. They, of course, we're human, so they don't always, but they can. And sort of to connect this to the God and ethics issue, it just seems to me that all of this can be going on without God having to be there sort of in the background, as it were. The suffering of this homeless person is, in my view, intrinsically bad. You don't need God looming over the situation or somehow in reality in order to make that suffering bad. And that suffering is what gives you the reason to alleviate alleviate it if you can by the hot drink. And that too exists and is in the database or whatever, even if you don't have God in reality. So I think another way of seeing what seems to me to be the superfluousness of God for the existence of objective morality is to think about reasons and what can give us reasons. Just like in the cheesecake case, God or no God, it's crazy for me to eat this poisoned cheesecake, right? We don't need God to somehow make it irrational. It's just in the nature of the situation. And similarly, in that case of the homeless person you could easily buy the hot drink for, the reasons to do it are already there in the situation itself. The suffering is intrinsically bad. You don't need God to be part of the equation in order for those reasons and the obligation to exist.
It's really helpful. Really helpful. Thank you for that. I'm aware there's loads of little tangents we could pull in and push in, but I'm aware that we're pressed for time. So I've got kind of two final questions. I mentioned one on fear. I think it's really interesting in your book. You kind of speak about, I guess, humanity's need for religion, about the kind of reality that religion provides solace for evils faced and comfort for evils ahead. And essentially kind of, it could be and often is fear that drives people to religion. You then go on to talk about kind of how courage can set us free. I think I'd like to hear more about this. I think the sort of phrase that you use in the book is something like, the victory of accepting naturalism consists in exerting control over one's own mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, easier said than done, I gotta say. A couple of things. So this comes up, I think, in the book, in connection with, I think, Bertrand Russell, and so Russell, just briefly, was a kind of before there were new atheists. He was a new atheist before the so-called new atheists. So he not only does he think there's no God, but he seems to see religion as largely an evil force in the world and so on. And I think he says that fear is the main thing that drives people to religion. Now, in the book, I mean, I think that is probably not true. I just think it's much more complicated than that. So, for example, in the book, I make the simple point that, look, a lot of people are simply raised into religion. So I think this Russellian thing is kind of a caricature. People, it's just this superstition that people are driven to out of terror of death. That is just it's not accurate. I think it's just way too simple. I think the fear can be one factor, and there's no question that religion can provide a kind of comfort and solace. I think if I were writing this part of the book, I probably would write it a bit differently, man. I still do think, there is something admirable about just sort of what I would see as just facing reality, which is we're all going to die, and that's going to be the end of it. And being able to just live with that is a kind of accomplishment. I think that it's funny. I think that it's to me, it seems like it's the kind of thing that at least one way of sort of living with it is just getting used to it over time. And I think that so William Craig, and I quote this in the book, he describes this experience that I think is not uncommon when he was a kid, and it sort of hit him for the first time that like he was really going to die, and I think this, which I think is an experience a lot of kids go through. It's one thing to know it abstractly, but then to sort of connect it to yourself, and there's not going to be me anymore. I just think at first it's terrifying, but if you just live with it for a long time, you just get used to it. You know what I mean? I think it's it's the kind of thing that just happens with just the way human psychology is. We get bad news and we're freaked out at first, and then after a while, we have a tendency to adjust to it. This is just part of our innate ability to sort of survive. And I was struck by this. There's this book that I read after I wrote the Value and Virtue book called Society Without God. It's by this sociologist, Phil Zuckerman, and he studies these sort of Scandinavian countries, which are extremely secular. And one striking thing that he found is that not only are a lot of the people in these countries not religious, they're totally uninterested in religion. And they don't even really get this idea of the fear of death and I think it's because they're just so used to living with the idea that that's how it is, and there's nothing to be done about it, that it loses its terror, and it does not freak them out. And so I guess this is an idea that if I were writing the book now, I would put this in there, which is I think in the book I was portraying it as sort of this great accomplishment if you can conquer your fear of death. I think now I'm more inclined to the view of like, it's a kind of accomplishment, but actually the way to do it is not through some heroic philosophical, or act of self-control, but rather just to let time pass, and you'll just get used to the reality or the idea that this is how it's going to go. Did that get at your question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like David Hume, as he was coming to the end of his life, he knew he was going to die. There were quite a few people quite shocked at how at peace he was about the fact that he was going to die. Like this atheist should be screaming, panicking, worrying, but he wasn't. He was very, very, very peaceful.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is interesting. Thinking, clarity, having that time to reconcile yourself. These are all really important features, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think Hume's an interesting example where, how did he do it? It's just he just got used to it through his whole. I mean, he had thought that way his entire life. I think what would be much more terrifying is if you were a theist until the last second and you somehow lost your faith, and all of a sudden you were faced with this new reality. That's sort of horrific. But it seems plausible that for Hume it was just like for most of his life he had gotten used to the idea that that's how it was going to be. That reminds me of just one other thing about this Society Without God book that was sort of striking, which is some of the people, or at least one person that Zuckerman was talking to, it may have been a nurse or something who worked in like a hospice care situation. or a hospital of some kind, of course, where people were dying and facing death. And that person was explaining that in like Sweden or Denmark, Norway, whatever. Of course, there are some, religious people, Christians, and that they were saying that it tended to be the Christians who were most terrified at the end of their lives, and they were terrified about going to hell, basically, had they, lived the right way and so on. Whereas the non-believers who, again, had just lived for a long time with the idea of like, I'm going to die and that'll be it, were much more calm and peaceful in the face of death, because they didn't have the sort of terror of what was going to happen in the afterlife. So I guess the point maybe is, overall, is the psychology of all of this is a lot more complicated than it's sometimes portrayed maybe on the theist side. That the religious perspective is always comforting, and the atheist perspective must be terrifying. And the Hume case is interesting. Yeah, people were amazed. How is he doing this? Well, it's only amazing because you're just sort of trapped in this particular way of looking at it. It's just a lot more complicated, maybe.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've got two boys, 6 and 8, so both very, very young. When I first started going through my sort of, I guess you call it a deconversion or whatever it is, I was absolutely terrified by the idea that they were going to pass away and I wouldn't be able to see them again. Like that would be the end of the relationship. And the more I've reflected on it, obviously I have no desire for them to pass away before me. Like that's not something I'm asking for. But the more I've thought about it and reflected upon it, I also kind of wonder if people do lose those close to them, whether they are actually not able to fully mourn that loss because there's always the hope of what's to come. It kind of, those who hope in that thing kind of view it as, well, you must be living a nihilistic, kind of like completely sort of devoid of joy life. Whereas actually, the more I think about it, the more people can actually begin to celebrate and recognize the life that they had the interaction with for what it was. And actually that's quite a special thing, though many theists wouldn't understand that. I don't know, that's my 2 pence on the thought of fear and death and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. Again, to me, probably on both sides, there's just some caricaturing of what the psychology of the other side must be like. And, human beings are complicated, and there are a lot of different attitudes and so on. But I think the way you describe that makes a lot of sense. There's you've probably seen the film Dead Poets Society and the Carpe Diem idea. I think it captures maybe a reasonable way of looking at things on the atheistic side, where this is it. And that makes, on the non-theist view, this is it. The time we spend with our loved ones is the only time we're going to spend with them. And yeah, that does make it extremely precious. And it runs against, I think, the idea, which I mentioned this in the book, Craig presses, that without God and an afterlife, everything in this life is sort of meaningless and it doesn't really matter. And I think it seems to run in the opposite direction. If this is it, then like it really matters, right?
Yeah, it does. Okay. I don't want to abuse your time. We have a final sort of kind of question or area to look at, which is kind of how you close it. But basically, you talk about how all these threads kind of come together and could be, I'm not saying that this is what you say, but they could be presented as sort of humanism or humanistic kind of values. You also then go on to talk about a sort of a student objection to humanism. I thought it'd be fun to pop my screen up to show that. So I'm just going to read this out for those who are listening to the show rather than watching the show. So this is the student humanism objection. 1, if humanism is true, then most humans have lived lives devoid of internal meaning. 2, but it's not true that most humans have lived lives devoid of internal meaning. 3, therefore humanism is false. So Professor Wielenberg, it'd be interesting to chat through kind of the strands of your thoughts and your arguments, whether they do lead to humanism, and then also address this student objection, which I thought was really well done in your book.
Yeah. So I think at least one point I was trying to make in the book in connection with this is, I think psychologically, our difficulty of getting away from the idea of like, how to put it, the universe at some level has got to make sense. And so like it can't be deeply unfair. And so if you think about this objection, the objection is, it's along the lines of like, if a certain thing were true, that would really suck. Therefore, that thing's not true. And I think one of the points is just the fact that something would be really bad is not a compelling reason to think that it's not true. So that was one of the simple points I was making in considering this argument. I think but there is this question, if there is no God, if naturalism is true, and then you think of all human beings, how many of them have had meaningful or valuable or good lives? And I don't know. I have no idea what the percentages would be. It's a hard thing to estimate, but it certainly seems that there would be large numbers of people who had pretty not great lives. I mean, you just think of there are plenty of people who, if this is it, they never really had a chance. They died super young, and it was a lot of suffering and so on. And yeah, that sucks. But it's not the fact that it's really bad or unfair isn't really a compelling reason to think that that's not what reality is like. To maybe add a bit more, though, I do think, if I'm remembering correctly in the book, I might have connected this to this view that Aristotle had, where he seems to have what I think is a peculiar view, where at the very end of the Nicomachean Ethics, which is sort of his major work in ethics, he says that, well, the best human life will be, predictably the life of a successful philosopher who has all this knowledge of what the world is like, and then simply reflects on how the world works and basks in the glory of their understanding. And he argues that this is a great life because this must be what the gods are doing all the time. So he's got this very interesting Aristotelian theology that the gods spend all their time just contemplating reality. And then as human beings, there's this elite few, the philosophers, who are able to live like the gods for these brief periods of time, and so they have the best life. But this, on Aristotle's view, that would be extremely rare, and most people would not, do that at all. Now, I think, so in that view, almost nobody would be living the best kind of human life. I don't really think that would be an objection to Aristotle's view. I think that view is implausible for other reasons. But so I think that's one way this comes up. For myself, I think, I have what I think is a much more sort of intuitive view, which is that love is one of the main things that gives human life, value and meaning. And I think it's good news that lots and lots of people who can't do philosophy and go through lots of suffering, nevertheless have lives that include love. And so those lives will include some value and meaning. So I do think there is some good news on the naturalistic side, which is human beings are built for love. And despite all the suffering and injustice in the world, there's also love mixed in there. And so I don't think we're in a situation where like the vast majority of human beings are living these sort of pointless, empty lives. Reflecting back on my answer, it was sort of meandering, but I hope that got at some of what you were
Yeah, no,
about.
it did. It was beautifully said. I'm aware we've been going now for close to 2 hours, so I want to let you go. But before I do that, where would you want to point people to engage further with you? I'll have links in the description to all the books and the video that you had or the debate that you had with William Lane Craig, the video for that as well. But is there anywhere you'd want people to go to check you out further?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the books and the debate would be some of the main things. I guess I do have just a website through DePaul. I can send you the link to that if you'd like. which that includes links to a lot of, in addition to the books, of course, I've got some articles and so on, and ranging from the more, academic stuff, but I've also got, I think, some more accessible versions of some of my ideas. So I think that would be another useful read if you're interested in delving further into some of my ideas. I think that would be, I try to sort of consolidate a lot of resources through my website.
Yeah, please do. I'll make sure that's linked in the description. So listener, viewer, check that out. And Professor Wielenberg, it's been an absolute delight speaking with you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, you're very welcome. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk about these ideas, and especially just to sort of go back to this book that I wrote so many years ago. And so I very much appreciate our conversation.
Thanks for checking out this episode. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And make sure you check us out over on Locals. Cheers.